I decided to make We Caliban about the story that we don't see on stage. If there are two young people and someone's teaching someone else to dance, it's inevitable that you're going to have a slightly more intimate experience. There's something about brown or black man, white woman, that is deep in psyche. Prospero says, "You dishonored my daughter," but we don't actually see that in the play itself. It's just something he says. Miranda says, "I taught you language, but I couldn't change you. You were still a brute." Anyone who goes to Hindustan, India, will immediately notice that actually most people have no moral sense, and they themselves are willing to admit.
Hi everyone, this is Sailesh Ram, AsianCultureVulture.com. I'm with the amazing Shobana Jeyasingh. We're going to be talking about We Caliban, which is a new work, just came out in September. It's going to be at Sadler's Wells East. We're in Sadler's Wells, the main Sadler's Wells. Shobana Jeyasingh, welcome to AsianCultureVulture.com. How are you?
I'm fine, particularly today. It's a lovely sunny day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So We Caliban is developed from the Tempest, William Shakespeare. Why the Tempest and why Caliban?
Well, actually, The Tempest is a play that I've read over many years, because when I was at university, that was one of my texts that I had to look at. So it's something I went into very deeply. But one thing that has surprised me, like most people at university, I think they concentrate on the hero. He's called Prospero, and he's the Duke of Milan, so Italian. And the story is that, he gets shipwrecked and then he's washed up on this unknown island and then meets the inhabitants who are not European, and the story goes from there. So, yeah, when I was at university, I was kind of interested in the hero because obviously he's the main character. Yeah. But one of the things that's interested me over the years is the inhabitant of the island is a man called Caliban. And I think it's meant to be a sort of an anagram of cannibal, because when Shakespeare was writing, this word cannibal was a new word that came into play. So I was interested in that.
He's like a brown man.
Yeah, anybody who's not European,
yes.
Because at the time when Shakespeare was writing his play, that was a time when England, Spain, Portugal, they were all getting onto ships and looking for new lands, new sources of wealth, new places to dominate. So it was the kind of empire building or the colonizing era. So it was a time that was probably very exciting and new when he was writing this play. And it's really interesting that he set this story. So the main story is about the Duke of Milan and what happened to him. But the sub-story is the fact that he's in a country which is non-European, which I think is quite very radical for Shakespeare's time, I would imagine. So part of the story is what happens to that encounter between this European noble man and the brown inhabitant of this island. And actually that's something that, immediately rings bells, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I was interested in that relationship. So one of the rereading The Tempest from that point of view, there were so many things that, chimed with me, because in the story what he says is that when he first met Prospero, they were getting on famously, and Caliban showed Prospero everything about the island, But then it changed because his daughter decided she was going to civilize Caliban by teaching him her language, which didn't go very well. And then the relationship really deteriorated, with Prospero saying to Caliban, "You tried to dishonor my daughter, and then after that I'm just going to punish you." And then so he's just made to work as a slave, to carry wood, to cook the food, etc. So it's a relationship that started well, and then there was an attempt to quote unquote civilize this person, Caliban, mainly through the teaching of language. And then he was accused of bad morals, and then that was the end of the relationship. And I thought that was actually quite an interesting narrative in it.
So how do you translate all this into a dance work? Can you talk about the process? And you begin with the text, and then how does it, do you work with Usma Hamid, the dramaturg? Or how does it become something alive?
Yeah, well, that's the hard bit, because obviously that's a play, and it's a beautiful play. So I'm not going to replicate the play, and also I don't work with actors. So really, it sort of takes a couple of years of reading, talking, thinking, reading around the subject, lots of conversations to see what's the story one wants to tell, And so the end of my research, I think what I found was the story I wanted to tell was actually not staged in the play. So everything I wanted to create was actually only reported. See, for example, Prospero says, "You dishonored my daughter," but we don't actually see that in the play itself. It's just something he says. Miranda says, "I taught you language, but I couldn't change you. You were still a brute." But we don't see her teaching language. We don't know how these lessons went. Did Caliban enjoy them? Was he just a bad student? So I decided to make We Caliban about the story that we don't see on stage. So that was a big decision,
Okay.
So, and then I also wondered, what was Caliban like before he met Prospero? Because that's quite important to people like me, because before I started talking English and my grandparents decided to learn English, there was a different kind of life. They had their own language, they had their own culture. And I think one of the features of this culture is that they were in one place, and everybody met people who they knew, and they all spoke one language and probably had customs in common. So it was a much more communal and cohesive setup, So the first 15 minutes of We Caliban is just capturing what that would have been like. People together, speaking in one language, being in one place, having a sense of community, and then the play happens to them. Then Prospero enters them, and then we see what happens to this teaching of language, and also this whole thing about, did Caliban really try to dishonor this young woman?
You very much located this story, We Caliban, in that time period.
Yeah.
So that's important. So can you talk a little bit about the choices that you made?
Isn't the historic music. So the music is there to help people understand the story, So for example, for the first 15 minutes, the one I call We Caliban, which is just about the pre-colonized state, if you like. We thought about the island, and one of the things that Caliban says is, you realize how much he loves his island and how much he understands the geography of the island, the climate of the island. So there's lots of things in the play which really build up the sort of ecology. You kind of get a feeling of a person whose, their life is so deeply knitted into the geography of the island. So he knows where the springs are, he knows where to find the fish, he knows where the trees are, and he obviously loves the beauty of his island. And the main character, Prospero, what he does is he comes in, actually he disrupts, because he creates a magical storm. So he kind of disrupts nature. He's a bit like a modern technocrat, I guess, It's about using technology to, change nature and to command nature to do what he wants. So he's not happy with the monsoon coming in July and September or August. He wants to create it when he wants the monsoon to happen, So that love of nature that you see in Caliban, that influenced the first 15 minutes of music, which is just made out of bird song and very natural sounds. And to me, it's a beautiful piece of music. And it's held like that for 15 minutes, It's like being inside a forest, really. That's how I think about it.
Wonderful. Amazing.
And then the music changes for each scene, So When we take the audience to the power struggle, then we have texts from Shakespeare. We also have drums. So it really serves each scene.
Okay. Do you see We Caliban as a metaphor for colonialism?
It is. I think inevitably, whenever you say a European man came on a ship to an unknown island, well, unknown to him, that is, and then meets somebody who doesn't look like him, of a different color, of a different culture, of different language, that's inevitable. That's what you think of, because that's the biggest, well, certainly in my life, that's the biggest influence, Otherwise, I'd be sitting in somewhere in South India talking Tamil, which I'm not, obviously.
So that encounter between the European and the
the non-European,
the words are being invented as Shakespeare is writing. I was very interested in the first part where they're almost like equals, and then suddenly it becomes like master and slave. And what happens? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how it's expressed in the work.
So the first thing is teaching language. I mean, with dance, we do use some of Shakespeare's language in the score. So you hear some key lines that Caliban says. One of the things that Caliban says is, yes, you taught me language, and my profit is now I know how to curse. So that's an attitude towards being taught a language, not his language, maybe a kind of condescension and anger, So we use, I think Shakespeare's words helps us tell the story, but also it's the story of two young people in trying to teach language or any kind of teaching. So I presume that it was not just language, but maybe culture. And so she comes from the court. So I kind of imagine it will be courtly culture. So, maybe kissing the hand or learning how to do the waltz or, so that is what we stage, But obviously, usually, if there are two young people and someone's teaching someone else to dance, it's inevitable that you're going to have a slightly more intimate experience, especially there's only two people in the thing. So it's just imagining. So telling the story is obviously dance, movement, dramatic movement is there. There's music. We also have film projections, and then we have Shakespeare's words. And then we also have quotes from historic texts. So, for example, we use the letter that Queen Elizabeth I wrote about Walter Raleigh, because he was obviously one of the biggest explorers.
Know ye that of our especial grace we have given and granted to our trusty and well-beloved servant, Walter Raleigh, Esquire.
Basically, she says, I give you permission to go anywhere and possess lands as long as they're not Christian. So, and I'm giving you, my permission to go and do that. So that's quite interesting that she felt she could give permission for him to go and...
It's a kind of civilizing
mission. Correct.
And proselytizing, because it's about non-Christian countries.
Yeah, that's it. Correct.
Yeah, so again, how does that translate itself into We Caliban?
We hear these words when these dancers are... So we hear them at the end of the image of them, before their kind of communal self, if you like. So we set the history, So we kind of say, okay, it's this time, and so that is really the context of the story. So those kind of historical texts give you context. And the other big thing, the most worrying thing in a way, is when Prospero says to Caliban, you tried to assault my daughter, because that's, if you're an audience hearing that, your sympathy is definitely not going to be with Caliban. So that's something I thought about a lot. And there were two stories that came to mind. One is, that famous book, Passage to India. Yeah. So there we have a similar sort of setup, because there's an English woman who goes into the Malabar caves with, Dr. Aziz, who helped her. Actually, she's his friend, But somewhere inside the cave, she comes out saying he assaulted me, and it goes to the court, and then in the middle of the thing she says, okay, I withdraw my accusation. So there's something about brown or black man, white woman, that is deep in psyche, you know. So even though this man never went into the cave, she felt that she had to make this accusation. And also there's another story, To Kill a Mockingbird, where again a black man's accused of assaulting a white woman, goes to court, and in that case, because it's in the south of United States, he is accused and imprisoned, and then he gets shot trying to escape. And again, the audience and the reader knows it's not him. But it's almost like the weight of history is such that it's difficult for that brown person to assert their innocence.
Yes.
Because the court itself is sort of prejudiced, you know. So that's something, you know, it's probably the most difficult thing that one had to think about, you know, how one stages this accusation.
Sure.
So
well, we have the Epstein files, you know, all the ramifications of that.
Yeah,
and
that's
similarly,
right.
powerful men in positions of
Correct.
Wealth and privilege.
Yeah, correct. When
young
I was
girls.
choreographing, Epstein things hadn't come out, but what I did have, and it's something Uzma, who's the dramaturg, you know, she found this amazing historical text. I think it was written in like 1740, something like that, by this man called Grant, who wrote a paper called About the Morals of People in Hindustan. So he basically says everybody in this country is immoral, they're depraved, and really they themselves admit it. Anyone who goes to Hindustan, India, will immediately notice that actually most people have no moral sense, and they themselves are willing to admit. So that's the kind of culture within which I wanted to place this scene.
Thank you so much for your time. Brilliant.
Very
All
good.
the best for We
Yeah,
Caliban.
thank you.
Thank you.